Hello everyone, today we continue our series about Serbian history. In the last episode we looked at the Principality of Serbia in the High Middle Ages. We gave a look at Duklja, Trvunia, Zaklumia, the Narentines, Bosnia, and we observed how fundamentally after the terrifying devastation of the Serbian territory at the hand of the Bulgarians in the 10th century, there is a period of relative revival that is connected also with improved relation with the Byzantines, but also a final collapse of this early Serbian state, whose ruling dynasty extinguished after the death of the Prince Časlav. Nobody really knows who inherited the Serbian Principality at this point, how power was transmitted. Unfortunately, we're not that informed. In any case, we know that the Byzantines take advantage of this between the 40s, the 60s of the 10th century. At the time of Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, I made a video about his reign, by the way. The general sense is this Byzantines takeover and information about the former ruling Vlastimirović dynasty of Serbia fading, disappearing. The new emperor, John I Tsimiskas, essentially destroyed the Bulgarian Empire in 971. There would be, as you know, a later revival that would be dealt with by Basil II, made multiple videos on that, both from the Bulgarian and Byzantine sort of side of the story. And this meant, together with the events that happened in fact so regionally, other than just locally, that the Byzantines reached the Danube in terms of direct control once again. Of course, this area north of the Balkan Mountains was not so directly controlled as the one in the south, even at this point. But you essentially notice that in Serbia, there are some Byzantine officials that directly rule locally. Naturally, it's not such a clear-cut picture. We know of between the end of the 10th and the early 11th century of pretty troubled situation with continuous conflict and, if not properly, violence between the Byzantines, the Bulgarians, and the Serbs. Very, again, blurred area in terms of who really had the upper hand at some point or another, except at this point at large, especially from the Serbian side, it was the Byzantines. Naturally, there had been sort of entente between Constantinople and the Serbs as far as the Bulgarians had posed a threat to both. The main difference is that while Bulgaria was just next door to Constantinople, and so it was sort of this looming threat that needed to be dealt with more directly, because it also was a much larger power than Serbia. The latter was located so northwest, in part also into the Balkan Mountains and the Dinaric Alps, that there was much less sort of even necessity of direct confrontation with the Serbs to reduce them to reason, except as we will see now, as far as the Adriatic and the Ionian sector was concerned, if the Serbs had such a great power to be able, in fact, to take the sea and harass the Byzantine coastal areas there, but we will see it now. In any case, at this point, we see that after that sort of, fallout produced by the Bulgarian devastations, there is a lot of coin hoarding, for example. That definitely speaks of, again, of an important instability. The country had gone unpopulated to many areas, and many communities were relocating depending on especially security reasons. In all this, there were actually the Magyars. We will not talk about them too much, but a good ride from Hungary into Serbia was sort of a bit of a leitmotif of this region history. The Byzantines organized Serbia in a catapanate that took the name after the fortress of Raska. We will talk about this in other, say, when they would come back, say, on horseback in Serbian dominance. This meant that there was a local Byzantine captain instead of the local Slavic prince ruling as an administrator from a central position. In fact, Raš, right? And this Stari Raš, as you know, this fortress located in the vicinity of the former marketplace of Staro Trgovište. I will be butchering Serbian names anyway, but this play again a crucial role in the country's history. The title was not just Captain, Katepano, Capitanus, Catepan, but Dux sometimes as well, because of the militarized Balkan situation, and as we will see now, the terrifying interland that, as you know, was a nightmare strategically for everybody involved. Constant guerrilla warfare, terrible terrain that the locals knew how to exploit beautifully against the imperial forces, luring them in ambushes with bloody results. In fact, this Byzantine regime wouldn't last that long, especially after the death of John Tzimiskes in 976. There was a major rebellion that we have seen in the video about the First Bulgarian Empire, that is the Kometopuli I. The Kometopuli were a dynasty, effectively the last royal one in the First Bulgarian Empire. They ruled until, in fact, from this year until 1018, right? And this was, in fact, a revival of Bulgarian power, never been tamed, especially again in this Balkan hinterland. It was a very difficult control. Together with an effort to restore some Bulgarian state. Naturally, the Byzantines had already sort of crippled significantly the foundation of the Bulgarian Empire. That would be destructured further. There had been properly a statehood being built with great difficulty during the centuries against also the local nobility and an attempt of centralization. The Byzantines, of course, give this dramatic blow, and so nothing in Bulgaria will really be the same as before. And this, by the way, triggered another series of essentially continuous wars until 1018, placing the Serbs in a quite interesting position. Because, of course, they were caught a bit between two fires. We know of a Serbian delegation to the same Basil II in Constantinople, traveling by sea between 991 and 92, coming from some Serbian coastal area. We don't know exactly which, but the one that would effectively be controlled by Duklja, that is the one we're looking at today. We know, in fact, in the same period, that the ruler of maritime Duklja, John Vladimir, where at the turn of the millennium, had already been gaining this prominence in Serbia as a whole. And so what we'll see today is this Dukljan hegemony. Like later, as we will see in the 12th century, Duklja changed into Zeta, but this state would be the same. Eventually, Raska would rise to prominence, but throughout the 11th century, the Dukljan primacy contributed, in fact, to the recompaction of the later Serbian state and kingdom proper that we will see in another video. Today, we remain fundamentally within the confines of the 11th century. We'll talk also a bit into the 12th, basically, at that point of the decline of Duklja and sort of the subsumption of the same into different centers of Serbian power. In 1018, Bulgaria was basically exhausted, prostrated, and defeated by Basil II. The Bulgarian Emperor Ivan Vladislav was dead, and in all this, Constantinople succeeded in exploiting the confusion, the fragmentation, the disorder, not just in Bulgaria, like to fundamentally keep it at bay further, like molding it into this still sort of decentralized autonomous government, but in fact a much more easily controllable. The Bulgarians would emerge only later on towards the end of the 12th century, where things were starting to go wrong. In fact, after the Komnenian period for the Byzantines, once again, up to that point, not much really had occurred. But also in Serbia, right? That sort of lived, of course, of this promiscuity, this sort of not particularly neatly defined eastern frontier, that as a country, as we know, belonged technically to the Byzantines, that, as we've seen, had basically been oriented in controlling the country. So much so that with the victory of Basil II over the Bulgarians, Serbia herself is transformed into a theme, right? This military administrative province ruled by a strategos, right? And so, in this sense, with significantly strategic nature. For this reason, Duklja, so the part that is technically in the Balkan hinterland, but it also reaches the Adriatic Sea, was subordinated instead to the Dukes of Dyrrhachium. We'll talk about the Battle of Dyrrhachium later. I made a video recently about that, so I don't have to describe, of course, what this is, even in general, for common knowledge. We do not know what was happening in other internal areas such as Travunia. In fact, this is a very underdocumented reality, and nobody can really say. We know that local Serbian princes kept ruling over Zaklumia, for example, but that also this area was absorbed by under the Byzantine government. We know, for example, the Prince Ludovic, so a formerly independent local Slavic chieftain and ruler of Zaklumia with the title of Knez, being invested by the Byzantines in this sort of ambiguously decentralized, almost ad personam recognition, in fact, of the title of Protospatarios epi to Chrysotriclinum, that is to say, that the first sword bearer. The Protospatarios was, at this time, like it had derived, like we talk about the honors in Byzantine history. This started as court dignities, eventually becoming, like in this case, especially from the 8th to the 12th century, in the case of Protospatarios, a title for generals, provincial governors, and like in this very case, foreign principalities. We know that Ludovic was notice here also like the more Carolingianly Germanic influence name in even the Slavic version, and so that important situation of ambiguity with a growing West, right, post-Frankish, post-Carolingian reality like this one, and the title of Strategos of Serbia even, and Zakluma. But of course, these guys did not rule over sort of a unified Serbia or anything that could resemble that at this point. So why do we talk about Duklja and the connected Vojislavljević dynasty? Because this territory, by the way, encompasses today's southeastern Montenegro, from the Bay of Kotor in the west to the Bojana River in the east, so encompassing actually a great deal of pretty tough interland, plus the sources of today's Montenegrine, Zeta and Moraza rivers in the north, would rise to such aforementioned primacy, but not say hegemony necessarily on the rest of Serbia. There were some tributary connections and also control, like in fact of the rest of the Serbian world. But if anything, it's also the head rather of the country that is co-opted by the Byzantines, and also that are struggling against the activity of such potentate to a degree, it also allows us to document it effectively. Duklja, as we said in the previous video, was mentioned for the first time in the 10th century. The most, the only sources, basically, like almost, the ones that allow us at least to reconstruct satisfactorily Dukljan history, date in fact to the 11th, 12th century Byzantine chronicle. Right, we're talking about authors like John Skilitses, his continuation, Katakalon Kekaumenos, and the same Anna Komnena that, in fact, talks about the Dukljans, as we will see later, also in the Battle of Dyrrhachion. That we read her account, and we will come back on it briefly, like to exemplify this in her work, the Alexiad, about, of course, the deeds of her father Alexius I Komnenos. The De Administrando Imperio by Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, that, as we've seen in previous videos, of course, gives us an important history of the origin of the Serbs in the region, actually from the external. It does not talk, even in its sort of ecumenically encyclopedistic orientation, very much read in a Roman imperial fashion, doesn't really mention Duklja nor any of her leaders, which is actually what we use mostly also through other means to track, in fact, like local political history. In fact, we have, for example, a lead seal from the 9th to 10th century that tells us about this Prince Peter of Duklja, but we do not know anything about him from any other source, basically, which tells you a bit how actually even more limited archaeology actually is, as far as, of course, historical reconstruction is. Without documentary sources, you don't really get anywhere, right? God bless narrative sources throughout all history. Never be skeptical of them, at least in an excessive way, just because they are narrative. So we know, however, of the aforementioned Jovan Vladimir, that was captured by the Bulgarians in 998-999 during an attempt by the side of the latter to conquer the very Duklja, which also tells you, like, shifting towards the west, almost the Adriatic Sea, how sort of still aggressive and in fact powerful the Bulgarians really were. Now, Jovan's capture led, however, to this, again, ambiguous condition of ally/subject, a delegated strongman, through his marriage with Kosara, a Bulgarian noblewoman that, at least the early chronicles telling us, being the daughter of the same Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria, the most important one of the era. This naturally connected him well also for further ascent, as we will see now, so much so that even with the Byzantines, this Bulgarian vassal had fundamentally positive relations. This may have actually even brought to his demise, because the Serbian nobility started being too suspicious of, in fact, a guy who was backed both by the Bulgarians and the Byzantines, and so too much power they would have been stripped of. In fact, when the powerful Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria died in 1014, his successor to the imperial throne, Gabriel Radomir, was killed by his cousin Ivan Vladislav, just 1 year, not even, I think, after accession to power. Now, this Ivan Vladislav was a cousin-in-law of the same Jovan Vladimir that was assassinated by him, right? And in front of the church of Prespa, which is a medieval town located in the homonymous area in southwestern Macedonia. This was a residence and burial palace of the Bulgarian Emperor Samuel, right? And it had even been properly, like, possibly at least the capital of the first Bulgarian Empire, the seat of the Bulgarian Patriarchate in the last phase of the first, at least in the last phase of the 10th century, so, and this before also the final collapse of the first Bulgarian Empire. Very significant location that naturally shows how Jovan Vladimir was connected with the Bulgarians. And this location also earned him, as the place of his death, gaining his martyrdom, right? Jovan was the first Serb to become a saint. He had apparently been a pious man, which of course, like, by 11th century Serbian ruler standards, may mean different things. Surely this was one of the most shockingly violent contexts you can imagine. But of course, like, sanctity was connected to some extent also to this, say, quality. The Byzantines, for example, described Jovan as a just man, a peaceful and virtuous one. Of course, he had been a friend of theirs, but we don't really know. Like, just this violence here, like, shows what the entire context of the Balkans was really about. Now, the next Dukljan ruler succeeding to Jovan was his paternal uncle. This was very important. It wasn't much of a patrilinear succession. The uncles at least gained precedence normally, or at least could at some time they would kill their nephews, as we will see the same Duklja later process. This is Dragomir. A local prince, really. He ruled both Stravunia and Zaklumia, not just Duklja. So these are the present day's regions of Herzegovina and South Dalmatia, right? He died in 1018, so he wasn't like a particularly mentionable ruler. He was succeeded by his son, however, Stefan Vojislav, that began essentially as a Byzantine governor, right? And as we will see now with our revolt, managed to gain further power in his land. And the Byzantines tell us that Stefan was a Serb, either a Travunian or a Dukljan. His mother was a daughter of Ljutomir of Serbia, that is almost a legendary figure among the rulers of Russia during its annexation of the Byzantine Empire. And there is some historical controversy regarding his figure. Like, sometimes he's also called Ljutofid. In any case, Stefan Vojislav was born in Brusno, in the Župa of the Drina, just after his father had died. So posthumously, he managed to maintain his inheritance, right, dynastically as a ruler, and we again don't know essentially what the founder of this Vojislavljević dynasty, that would be the one ruling in Duklja and in inner Serbia, emerged, etc. It's also somewhat normal, given the aforementioned, say, Travunia also refer to Dragomir. That's what their origins in part may have laid. Of course, there was some sort of higher Serbian nobility that married into one another from the most powerful clans of these provinces, let's say. As we've seen, Bulgaria after 1018 really collapses, and the Byzantines extend their power onto Serbia as well. However, the Byzantines themselves, after especially the death of Basil II, would not be faring particularly well. There was some sort of crisis in the next couple of generations until the rise of the Komnenians that would allow for the Serbians to autonomize themselves, however, at the cost of a clash against the same Byzantines. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos III Argyros or Argyropoulos died in 1034. Given the ensuing power vacuum, Stefan Vojislav took the chance of rebelling. However, the Byzantines crushed this uprising after 2 years and managed to capture the same Stefan, that is, deducted as a prisoner to the same Constantinople, which was a move sort of framing him, like indoctrinating him and sort of gaining some ascendancy in him, some safeguards about his possible, of course, coming back to Duklja. In the meanwhile, however, the Byzantines had also marched into Serbia and established again their thematic government, placing the general Theophilos Erotikos as the local strategos of Serbia. Stefan managed to escape from his prison. We don't know exactly when, in 1037-38. He was in Serbia by 1039, and he managed to expel Theophilos' forces, chasing the Byzantines down to the Balkan valleys on the Adriatic watershed, and in fact, essentially seizing control, not just like the Dukljan territories that had been controlled by the empire, but also what was called by the sources the Illyrian coast. That is to say, like the theme, part of the theme of the Iraqian, including the centers of Bar, Ulcini, and Shkodër, right, Skutari. This was a big blowback for the empire because Stefan began to engage personally into a piratic activity against the Byzantine coastline, essentially attacking and seizing the imperial ships during winter, by the way. The Byzantine Emperor Michael IV the Paphlagonian, that was ruling like after Romanos the Third, again made some videos covering the period, decided to respond, striking back on probably the Serbian interland bases of Stefan. In the spring of 1040, he sent the eunuch Georgios Provatus at the command of an important force that, however, was brutally defeated by the Serbians, who, again, as we were hinting at before, exploited magnificently the mountainous terrain full of gorges, ravines, trackless lands. Basically, Georgios lost control properly of the army, like the chain of command, like the necessity of splitting forces through these passes, where the Serbians ambushed the Imperials. They cut off the retreat at some point. They really managed to crush the Byzantine contingent, which of course encouraged Stefan Vojislav to push more. At this point, by the way, the Byzantines were in the aforementioned decline and political turmoil of the period. The new emperor Constantine IX Monomachos, ruling between 1042 and 1055, sent an expedition to Serbia in the autumn 1042. This was, of course, a secondary theater, but of course the empire had also been sort of insulted heavily. The expedition was massive, and it had to be launched under the literal best auspices. In fact, the Byzantines sent these forces into Serbia as in this autumn, just after the comet of October the 6th was observed. The sources tell us that the Byzantine army was as large as 40 to 60,000 soldiers, which is unlikely, telling you the truth, but surely they were in range of the tens of thousands, and they probably not much smaller than this. All right, so something like 20, 30,000 is plausible. This is a major expedition, perhaps slightly less, but it was evidently aimed at getting over with the Serbians. By the way, the army was headed by Michael, the Patricius Magistros and Dux of the theme of Dukljan. So this actually shows us how it was not necessarily a provincial, just a provincial campaign in scale, but of course it was entrusted to the command of the local, those who were more, experienced in dealing with the neighboring Serbians. And this massive expedition was initially successful. I mean, the Serbians, as we've seen also in the previous campaign, had, of course, acknowledged their strategic inferiority, and they had resorted to guerrilla, to ambushes, to this attrition, to essentially lure and wear out the Byzantine forces and striking them with at their weakest, right? There is this sort of Herbstnebel, right, in the Balkans. I would like to know that the Slavic equivalent to that. Initially, again, imperial might is to be felt. In fact, Michael enters deep into Duklja, right, and manages to actually capture a lot of goods, of people, and while burdened with them, takes the way back to Dukljan. However, this is exactly what the Serbs were awaiting for. Again, they hadn't had the strength to oppose this mighty force, but definitely given especially their historical, again, relation with peoples like the Avars, the Magyars, the Bulgarians, they were not really to back down in front of any raid. For that matter, the Byzantines would have been sort of theoretically more civilized even. Stefan organizes this ambush in the ravines of the Rumija mountain. This is carried out through the normal tactics that we have documented for the Balkans, also in the case of the Vlachs. For that matter, I made a video about Vlach infantrymen of exactly this period, because of the 11th century. You can see it from different depictions. Also, for that matter, in the same Byzantine chronicles, but from the illuminations are for slightly later years, especially these battles. I inserted the picture also here. You can see this massive storm of stones, arrows, right, naturally launched from the hilltops around the narrow pathways that the Byzantines had to cross forcibly. And this missile bombardment was quite necessary because of, again, the otherwise lack of force to simply strike the entire force without such preventive softening. The outcome was similar to the one of the Eunuch. Michael managed to come back to imperial-controlled territory with his life, but he allegedly lost 40,000 soldiers and 7 of his strategoi. This is again an inflated number, but again it does give you the idea of the heavy losses that the Byzantine forces suffered. You may never know, with the level of documentation, what really happened, whether properly the Byzantine army was destroyed. It was just suffered withdrawal of some sort. Nevertheless, this shows how hard the Serbs could strike back, right? This ambush was to be known historiographically as the Battle of Bar. This was carried out by a sudden attack on the Byzantine camp in the mountain gorge, right? That where the Imperials had stopped, right? And this is where allegedly the massacre took place. And there is all some interesting details, but of course not as many as we would like to really understand what happened. This defeat was, however, unexpected by the Byzantines, who, as a consequence, lost even more ground in the Balkan hinterland. This allowed the emergence of a Dukljan controls on the rest of the Serbian polities, which gave like a semblance of unitary dominion over, in fact, what were the historical Raska, Duklja, Trabunia, and Zahumlja. So between the rivers Neretva and Bojana. There were also other Serbian entities that weren't covered in here, but there were different clientary and hierarchical relations involved. We are objective in assessing that throughout this period. Of course, the Byzantines still controlled Serbia, right? That kept sort of, relating itself to Constantinople in sort of vassalatic terms, right, or something at least as subjection, and with, of course, an interested need in maintaining these channels open, right? What really matters here is the consolidation of Stefan's polity and the affirmation of the Vojislavljević dynasty. This is understood for the aforementioned reason a bit to, let's say spectacularly as sort of the first Serbian kingdom proper, but there is some basis to it, of course. Stefan Vojislav died sometime in the mid-40s of the 11th century, and he was succeeded by his son Mihailo, that took thus also the patronymic of Vojislavljević, that would give the name to the entire dynasty in this period. He rose to power accepted by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos in around 1053. We see very well like this relation with the empire demonstrated by the bestowal of the title of Protospatarius on the same Mihailo. This title, as we've seen, was just sort of fancy recognition. The part wasn't anything like particularly, again, meaningful in terms of direct Byzantine control or the subjugation of the Serbs or whatever. It was a title bestowed on imperial governors or some foreign rulers that were in some relation of subjection to the empire to some extent, as far as at least Constantinople was satisfied. And actually, for 20 years, the relation between the Serbs and the Byzantines were very good. This was partly occurring because of the lack of sort of initiative of this essentially rich, powerful, but also stagnating and sort of even declining empire, which actually led to the resuming of Serbian initiative, actually, only after the massive defeat of the imperial forces against the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manzikert, 1071. Right. This, as you know, is a huge chapter, like in Byzantine history. I also made a video, one of the first. I think it was the first battle that I made on Schwerpunkt. I covered on Schwerpunkt, and unfortunately, during the re-upload, it's just, I think, one of the only 2 videos that went lost for some technical problem. I admit it was a bit difficult to follow. It's more difficult than it would be today, so I will remake it. But, there is also a context there we have to talk about in the videos, sort of just about general Byzantine history. And it's interesting to talk about this for the Serbs now, because, as you know, this opened to other decades of instability and actually of a loss of control on vast areas of the Balkan hinterland from the side of Constantinople. The new emperor after Romanus IV was Michael VII Ducas. That wasn't really well loved in the empire. This brought to internal strife, and so this was normally the best situation for any Balkan power to reemerge, like mostly looting is always like into the Aegean. In this case, the Adriatic valleys, to again loot as much as possible, and basically it, right? Now in and withdraw, because yes, the sea was in any case controlled by the Byzantines. It is true actually that towards these Slavic territories in the north, things were getting a bit more complicated. So, but the Byzantine naval power is still a thing, and as we've seen, these powers were mostly, in a broader strategical sense, in the defensive. The Byzantine defeat at Manzikert also triggered the rebellion of the Bulgarians the year after. This started from Skopje and headed by the Bulgarian aristocrat Georgi Vojte. This brought to the invasion of the Byzantine theme of Bulgaria that had been established by Basil II. Its capital was Skopje. It was also governed by Strategos, who was again next door to Constantinople. And the Bulgarians asked the Serbians of Mihailo for help, right? The Serbian ruler sent 300 soldiers, headed by his son Constantine Bodin, and a commander, the voivode Petrilo. The armies gathered at Prizren, that is in today's Kosovo. Here Bodin was proclaimed a Bulgarian emperor and was given the name Petar, right? And because this, after there had been a Petar I as Bulgarian emperor, it was the son of Emperor Simeon. So here there is a connection, of course, not just with the, say, in part, the Bulgarian legitimization of some Serbian power through this dynastic self-aggrandizement, but also the actual capacity in a quite confused situation politically, because Bulgaria had been, as well as we've seen, sort of destructured as a major power, regarding who could become really ruler of what here. Now the Byzantines sent an imperial force to tame the rebellion, but they were defeated soundly by the Bulgar Serb force. The defeat went as far as the capture of some prominent commanders in the Byzantine field. Damian Dalasenos, that belonged to one of the most prominent aristocratic families of Constantinople during this century, and the Longobard mercenary Longibardopoulos, a general, essentially a mercenary, one of the commanders, in fact, that had been stationed in Macedonia during the uprising of Georgi Vojte, a southern Italian from the more autonomous Longobard communities that had been in Byzantine service. After this Bulgar-Serbian victory, Skopje was conquered, and the Allies split forces. Bodin went north towards Niš to secure it, while the voivode Petrilo went to the south to Ohrid, Devil, and Kastoria. So we're talking about this. We've seen these regions, by the way, in the video about the Battle of Pelagonia. And it's interesting to look at Balkan warfare and seeing how, of course, like all these valleys and localities were, of course, like always recurring during these upheavals in the region. Now the Byzantines crushed Petrilov at Kastoria, while Bodin succeeded in his intent to conquer Niš. Vojthe called Bodin to the south to reconquer Skopje that had basically fallen as well yet again in the hands of the Imperials. But while he was heading towards his objective, he was intercepted by an army, a new Byzantine army, crushed and taken prisoner. This all happened in 1072. The last event occurred in December. Bodin was captured at Taonios, also known as Pawnee Field, at least in later times. So Mihailo was, remember, Constantine Bodin was Mihailo's son. So the father sent some Serbian forces to take him back, but they failed. In the meanwhile, the aforementioned Longibardopoulos was essentially adopted by Mihailo at his court, right? And he was even married, in fact, to one of the ruler's daughters, which is interesting. He was essentially a brother-in-law to Constantine, and which entails for this man of fortune to pass at the service of the Serbs. And this involved, naturally, the presence of some Lombard soldiers at the Serbian court and in the Serbian army that were sent to attack the Byzantines, except for the fact that Longibardopoulos betrayed the same Serbs back again and returned to the Byzantines. By the way, the same Taonios. Evidently, they paid better. And in all this, Bodin, that, as we've seen, had not been released, was taken to Constantinople and imprisoned, and kept, in fact, at the Saint Sergius Monastery, like the Church of Saint Sergius and Bacchus. Today it's the little Hagia Sophia Mosque. Later, the Serbian prisoner was deducted as far as Antioch of Syria. However, Mihailo managed to bribe a group of Venetian merchants that were already, as we talk often about them in relation especially to the Byzantine Empire, already at this point before the Chrysobulla of Alexios I, as being very well infiltrated in the empire. And these men were tasked with essentially taking Bodin back. In fact, they succeed. The Venetians extract Bodin, and they bring him back to Duklja, right? Of course, against substantial compensation. Constantine, at his return home, was also reintegrated with the previous rule that apparently before his capture, his father has granted him as co-ruler, because the sources said that this previous rule was restored, and fundamentally that's how we can guess it. It would have been normal, by the way, nothing particular. If anything, it shows good relations with the father at that point. At this point, there is yet another twist, which involves also Croatian. We saw it, in fact, in the videos about the duchy and the later kingdom in the northwest. These are the years of the Gregorian reforms that we covered, as you know, at length. We will keep doing it forever, for the rest of your days. Just be aware of that. And there was a lot, of course, going on in terms of factionalism in the West, from one side, that the Serbs could sort of use at their benefit, but especially also great hostility against Constantinople. Right, Constantinople and Rome did not like each other at all, and especially now that the Roman bishops had claimed like properly monarchic status, or were handed towards that. These are the years, I mean, the Status Papa is 1075. Like, it was also not really a complete innovation, but this is the moment in which everything kicks in also much more iron-fisted way from the papal side. These are the years of the struggle with Henry IV, and again, this is not the context that we're observing. We just know it for also our better understanding what happened between Mihailo and the papacy, because the latter essentially recognized a royal title first to Demetrius Zvonimir of Croatia, king of Croatia and Dalmatia, in the same 1075, and Mihailo either the following year or the one after that. This is incredibly important because, as we'll see now, this is essentially the first Serbian ruler to be officially proclaimed a king. Right? We have a letter dated to January the 9th, 1078, in which the Pope, naturally from that Roman side, were much better documented, addresses officially, this is very important internationally, because the papacy was, together also with the empire, overwhelming all the, especially the Slavic side. The Serbs would remain what we call Orthodox, like this broader division and intention was not yet there, but this is exactly the point. King of the Slavs, right? So one king of the Slavs, of course, a king of the Slavs. Michaeli Sclavorum Regi, right, in the source. There is also a depiction of Michael. By the way, imagine, because of all the sort of, this is a very bad joke, but I must do it because after all these years on YouTube, that happens, there is something about, certain nationalities on YouTube, say, giving some sort of spectacle, for this sort of ultra-intense nationalism. There is, say, it's not the issue in itself, it's the fact that imagine the thing dating back to or these people actually knowing how it would become today, right? Of all this, possible fighters from, in the Balkans, with the whole sort of, I don't even know how to put an end geographically to this era, but let's say beyond the same Balkan world, and all the very, say, nice, positive feelings existing between one another, how the same Mihailo could boast this look, this Latin, relative ambiguity of look here, it's written that I am actually the king of these Slavs, of the entire Slavs, so that Serbia pre-existed the universe, and being at the head of the entire Slavic world. And of course, no, or depending on the situation, like no, the Slavic migration never existed. It's just, however, the centrality here of the Serbian world. It's a very bad joke, I know, but there is some fun in it. And surely there was some kind of vibe like that, because we have also an interesting, beautiful fresco from the Church of Saint Michael in stone that depicts Mihailo as a king, right? And of course, it referred to these international diplomatic recognition that, especially from the papal side, really elevated you to unprecedented degree. This is not just to say, okay, well, this is a Byzantine subject of some sort that nobody would care about. No, here's the papacy that hates the empire, by the way, to an extent that this manipulates it and sort of double plays with it. But that, of course, is a much bigger and much faster rising and illuminating polity. And this prompted actually Saint Byzantines to recognize not just Mihailo but also his successor Constantine as exousiastes, which is a term in Greek meaning literally one who executes authority. It was used in particular by Constantinople to refer to some sovereign foreign rulers. Prior, they used the term archon, which has to do with the arche, with the idea of somebody above, like somebody almost like an imperial type. About arche, Seleuke, like back in Seleucid Empire, that's why we call it like that. But of course, in this context, it's much more sort of local thing. Nevertheless, right, this guy, the meaning of the term is that this, by the way, Mihailo's successor, like he was in charge locally, who has earned even that due of even international recognition, as you understand. By the way, we don't know exactly what happened to Mihailo. The co-rule with his son continued until mid-1081. After this point, only Constantine Bodin is mentioned. And in all this, by the way, the relations with the newly ascended imperial house of the Komnenoi are positive. Anna Komnena, as we were saying before, refers to Bodin and Mihailo as well, too, as exarchs of the Dalmatians. Here, Dalmatia stands for, like, at least that section of the Serbian pertaining part, because there was also the third of the Croatian one. And we'll look at bit of also there decentralization, the complication of the picture. There was the Narentines that had been were other centers that at this point the Duklja did not really control. But as we've seen, that was a coastal power to begin with. The massive difference between the coast and the interland. Granted, the Byzantines are sort of, but the coastal cities are another world. Doesn't matter how sort of the mixed, like in leadership, they were with the Slavs of the interland, but they historically were slightly more, say, differently oriented at least. There is the sense that Alexius, through the Alexiad of his daughter, was sort of very well versed towards these rulers. This would also mark essentially the golden age of Duklja, right under Mihailo and Bodin, really. And there were contacts. This is a moment of greater expansion. The Komnenian era, I made a video just recently, was a moment of great revival of imperial power. At some point, we will see how this affected Serbia, also more negatively at some point. Constantine obtained the very high title of Proto-Sebastus that was essentially standardizing in the in this much more clearly cut, like high nobiliar, very narrow, right, sort of pool of clans that the Komnenian establishment represented, and essentially meaning first Sebastus, which actually was not exclusive, but it simply meant that you were almost like being part of the Augustan family, in a sense. So this is extremely positive relations between Alexius Komnenos and the Serbs at the beginning. By the way, at this point, also accomplice, as we've seen, the relations with Rome, the growth of Venetian trade, that, as we've seen, was useful also for the Serbs. It was all a contact, like the Balkan hinterland, the mountaineer populations, like sold in the Adriatic market. So everything was intertwined. There was an extension, like, of Mihailo's relations with, as far as southern Italy, that at least those lands that were still in Byzantine hands. So much so that Constantine Bodin married Jaquinta of Bari. What is interesting about her is that actually her father was a Norman, but was at the same time for a while essentially Byzantine governor of Bari, that, as you know, was a very sort of Greek city. The Italian interland is really something else. It's Italic, it's another stock, but Bari really had represented that very sort of Byzantine urban coastal dimension, except the Normans were essentially there already. In fact, at this point, Bari would be conquered by the Normans, but the local Byzantine governor, Jaquinta's father, Argyritsos, that we get the name of in Greek from the Byzantine sources, this was a nickname on him because this is not evidently not Western, was a Norman himself, and because of this, he actually backed the Norman conquest of southern Italy when this occurred, so that he switched to their side. And we will talk more about the Norman conquest of southern Italy because it's incredibly important. Like, we never really, aside from the kingdom, that is even more important, but the conquest proper is, especially in relation to the Byzantine presence in the south, very often misunderstood and instead incredibly irrelevant, because it could have gone really differently, like if it hadn't been for specific issues in Constantinople. And the Normans, as you know, were incredibly aggressive. They would become essentially the single greatest threat to the Byzantine Empire. The Seljuks, in comparison, are just, not even a thing. And in fact, they began to penetrate. Not just they started to attack the Byzantine Empire from southern Italy, but they particularly began to interfere with the Balkans as well, in the Balkan hinterland. As we've seen with this long burst, this Normans, the relations between one another, the Serbs had a lot to do already, and interestingly enough, because otherwise they're a very different world, as you understand. Robert Guiscard, as we've seen in the video about the Battle of Dyrrhachium, set his mind on this city as probably the gateway to eventually Constantinople. We know that failed. Alexius I was brutally defeated at the same Dyrrhachium that was temporarily lost, but he sort of managed equilibristically, also using the Cumans that had priorly attacked the empire. It's a total mess, by the way. The Serbs were exposed through the Balkan, through the Danubian Valley, to the steppes incursions. That's something that we've seen in the videos about Eastern Balkan warfare a lot, because this would influence significantly Serbian warfare. But say the Normans got eventually bogged down in Thessaly, in Greece, and so the alarm came back. This is why is this important? Because we have seen in the video about the Battle of Dyrrhachium that Constantine Bodin went over to the Byzantine army to fight the Siculo-Normans. But Anna Komnena herself, if I'm not wrong, we read it in the video, tells us that he didn't do anything during the battle. Essentially, he left when he saw likely that the Normans were winning through their ferocious heavy cavalry charges. And in fact, Constantine came back to Duklja. Now, this is fascinating, by the way, because the Dukljan power, as we've seen, has an Adriatic character. And so if Dyrrhachium was lost to the Normans, like, the major contact with the Byzantine Empire was lost. As we've seen, they had campaigned with the same Bulgarians in the east, so it's not that the Byzantines, there weren't contacts there, but sort of the most immediate focus of Mihailo and his son had been sort of the Dyrrhachium, against whom, as the Serbs had also fought. So the Byzantine defeat at Dyrrhachium, and this is also interesting, is used. You see, every time the Byzantines enter in crisis, the Serbs basically bail out of the vassalatic relation. They didn't like it, right? It was just like, even if they loved so much each other, letters, gifts, whatever. But of course, as soon as the empire grew weaker, and in 1081 it was about to disappear. This is not a joke. By the way, Robert Guiscard wanted declaredly to conquer Constantinople, so there is nothing really hidden or ambiguous about his intentions. Right? The Dukljans consolidate their power, and they actually attack the Byzantine garrisons in Raska. Right? Remember that this land had actually been part of the Vlastimirovich dynasty back in the day. And so it sort of represented for the Serbs, of course, a very important land to just retake control of in order to restore that grandeur, because that had been this much greater power than the one that was wielded now by the Vojislavljević. Bodin acquired control also on Bosnia. We had to make a video about Bosnia in the Middle Ages because it's quite an interesting frontier area throughout all its entire history. This was really beyond the sort of also direct. Here we don't even know exactly how Duklja could extend the control in direct terms. Bosnia, however, was a bit off limits. It was that much out there. It was more like in fact, the most distant of all these lands, which tells you, however, how at this point, like how powerful Bodin really was to in fact control it, even if indirectly. At least he appointed his governors there as well, which would have been negotiated with the local aristocracy, but still a great display of power. And these were, by the way, people from his own house. His nephews, Vukan I, that would actually, we'll see, become Grand Prince of Serbia later on, and Marko, as far as Raska is concerned. And then Stephen, as the Knets, the Duke of Bosnia, as we're told in the Chronicle of the Priest of Duklja. This was the first cousin of Constantine Bodin. All right, you can't call as the king or the sovereign of Duklja anyway. This naturally compromised, to say the least, the relations between Constantine and Alexius Comnenus. The Byzantines managed to regain Dyrrhachion from the Normans in 1085. There was a reversal in Guiscard's fortunes. I mean, the blow to the empire had been severe, but this lands fundamentally came back to the main bulk of its power. And the new ruler of Dyrrhachion, John Ducas, from the powerful clan that would in fact share so much with the same Comnenian emperors, was engaged in warfare with Bodin and Vukan. He managed even to capture Constantine in 1091 or 1092. Who ruled in his absence in Duklja was the aforementioned Italo-Norman Jaquinta, right, the Dukljan queen. At this point, Bodin, as we've seen, had a history of escapism that he wouldn't disappoint, and in fact he managed to flee prisoner once again, regaining his throne in Duklja in 1093 or 94, which also shows you how stable up to this point, like, his power bases really were. Right, nobody sort of usurped his throne. Right, admittedly, he lost, however, substantial amount of control on the aforementioned Bosnia and Raska, as more recent, if not acquisition, probably tributary states. Consider that in all of this, the Byzantines were again on the offensive once again, so Constantine's power was much reduced. Nevertheless, Constantine was described as the man who held all the power in essentially Roman Dalmatia. So not the part, for example, was ruled by Croatia, like that part of as Duklja, like the coastal part of Duklja, was really seen, right? Which also indicates that he, that's actually how much he controlled, because otherwise there were those other Balkan hinterland territories that he by this point lost. The last mention that we have of Bodin is 1096-1097. This is also related with the incredibly meaningful event of the First Crusade. Essentially, the contingent headed by Raymond of Toulouse and the Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy passed through Serbia, and Bodin and Raymond actually became blood brothers on the occasion. This is
quite interesting. Consider that Raymond, and we've seen it, I don't remember in which video, about the first crusade. Remember whether the Byzantine one about Alexius I, was actually friend to Alexius. So this connection has also some sort of Byzantine medium, a sort we can see better, because of course because of the Crusaders under the gates of in front of the gates of Constantinople, like Alexius had more important pressuring issues to think about than the Serbs. We know that Bodin died in 1101. Now, after this, actually, this kingdom, this first Serbian kingdom, recognized as such by the papacy, at least it's another personal kingship that is recognized. As you understand, then the boundaries of this power floated. Nevertheless, it's important, as we said at the beginning. However, it began to decline. Right, there is no doubt again that Mihailo and Bodin just temporarily had maintained some decades of stability. There is no doubt that Serbia was sort of growing, like the rest of Europe at this point, quite fast, starting to never greater, as we've seen also international connection, like the Serbs were sort of coming out of this sort of entrenched position from much more brutal times, and showing that they had the means and the capacity to sort of coalesce in the process. What is fascinating, of course, is how Duklja sort of rose at this point and later sort of declined within the same Serbia, right? Raska and Bosnia, as we've seen, had emancipated themselves from Duklja. That also was engulfed in the following decades by a terrifying civil war. And there was also a dynastic switch, because from Bodin, the rulers of Duklja were after him, were from the line of Branislav. There was Bodin's paternal uncle. The dates are also approximated because there is no proper historical records from this period. So we don't know exactly too much. We know Constantine's brother Dobroslav II that inherited actually the rule directly between 1101 and 1102. Then there was Kotsapar that briefly ruled between 1102 and 3 under, by the way, the suzerainty of Vukan, who was the Grand Prince of Serbia. We will partly see it now. Now, Vladimir II was king of Duklja between 1103 and 1113. And this was the oldest son of King Mihailo I. And so a nephew of King Constantine Bodin. He married a daughter of Vukan. These rulers, by the way, began to succeed one another relatively quickly, as you understand, which is not exactly a hallmark of particular stability. You have Constantine's son, George I, also known as Zorze Bodinović, that was a king of Duklja and Travunia at the same time, from 1113 to 1118 and to 1125 to 1131. He also ruled partly over inner Serbia, but just for a short time. This was actually like the gap in between is filled by Group Brescia Vojislavljević, that was essentially a Byzantine pawn, right, in another Serbian that had been backed by the Byzantines that hoped to interfere in Duklja. But as we've seen, George regained power. However, the Byzantines used another puppet, that is Gradina, who ruled Duklja from either, we're not even sure, 1131 to 1142 or 1135 to 1146.
It's mentioned in the Chronicle of the Priests of Duklja, and he's not to be found, in fact, in the same Byzantine sources as the other Serbian rulers and royalty. Right. By the way, these figures were not just random. The Skradinja was the son of the Dukljan prince Branislav and the brother of Gubresha, the former ruler. So it's a sort of complicated situation. Of course, there was violence going on, and this power vacuum, this instability was not really helpful for the locals. Gradinja was succeeded by his son Radoslav, who ruled from 1146 to roughly 1141. Some say up to later, but we do not really know even what technically happened to him later. This was a creation of Manuel I Comnenus. I made a video about him, and we have to talk a bit more about, because we talk about the Comnenian frontiers exactly under Manuel, but not for the Balkan theater. Later, this guy was not particularly successful. In fact, Deza, co-ruler from 1148 to 1153, alongside his elder brother Uroš II, great prince of Serbia, was the prince of Duklja, Travunia, and Zaklumia from 1149 to 1162. He would also become the Grand Prince of Serbia himself from 1153 to 1155, and again from 1162 to 1166, strip him of his lands that were hegemonized by Raska. Right. Then there was Mihailo, who was the son of Vladimir, succeeding him. We know from a letter sent by the Archdiocese of Antivari, Var, like today it's probably Latin Church Diocese of the Catholic Church in Montenegro, Grigor, that Stephen Nemanja, the great Shupan of Raska, and his brothers, and you have Stratimir Zavidović, ruling West Morava, right, was an appanage of the Grand Principality of Serbia, and Miroslav, of whom still Zavidović, in fact, the same brother, ruling on Zaklumia, right? We will look at this branch later. As maternal uncles of the same Mihailo, right? Who were in that position also, like exerting a great pressure on him politically to give up power. And so this gives you an idea of how miserable the 12th century was in Duklja, because you're looking at this history of Duklja, and we'll talk about Raska during the 12th century properly. But to the misfortune of the one corresponds to the fortune of the other. And we'll talk about Vulcan, so everything will be clearer in that context. By the way, Duklja, between 1113 and 1149, was not just the land of sort of greatest Serbian infighting, but also the one of greater Byzantine infiltration, as we were saying before. It was easier for the Byzantines to penetrate from there, especially during this time of great instability, to Serbian affairs than from the other side. Things happened there too, but this was a useful land to sort of surround Serbia to a degree, partly damaging also the sort of maritime dimension of the same. In fact, Serbia would develop more internally from Raska later on. And the Byzantines, as we've seen, were backing this guy or the other and maintaining a sort of control of the situation through that. Now the interesting thing, we talk about the kingdom, right? And to stress how ad personam this really was, is that in the historical account, we still see some Duklians getting a royal title, while others, however, were just princes. And this is important because, like, it's not like, I don't know, the word king and prince in terms of, ruler and apparent heir or something. Like they were like holding different titles depending on the situation, showing that depending on the person mostly, but also the situation, showing that there wasn't much of a great royal stability, especially in Duklja, or continuity in this tradition. We talked about Zorze before, the son of the same Constantine Boden. It said that he had a seal that said specifically Zorze, son of King Boden, which means that there was no kingship actually attributed to him, and so that even that papal recognition had been really internationally temporary. Like there hadn't been this continuity, there hadn't been a way also in front of the Serbian nobility to be as great as Mihailo and Constantine Boden. And this also was mirrored by this constant power struggles. I mean, these were weaker rulers. Indeed, there would be no one like them. Until by January 1186, Stefan Nemanja conquered Duklja, annexing it to Raska. And so we do not even know what happened to the last ruler, Mihailo. In 1189, we know that his wife, Desislava, was a widow, so he had died in the last years. Raska, as we will see better in the next episode, had been expanding politically and institutionally to the point of essentially figuring as a crown land that could thus claim this metaphysical overlordship over these other Serbian chunks, specifically Duklja, this case. The land, as we were prefiguring before, even changed name into Zeta, and we will talk about this perhaps in... So this was actually a crown land on its own at some point later on, until probably the end of the Serbian Empire, at the end of the Ottomans in the 14th century. And it's the Nemanjić that start ruling over this Duklja Zeta in the following centuries. The first one is Vukan, that we mentioned before, the Grand Prince of the Grand Principality of Serbia from 1202 to 1204. Also Grand Prince of Pomorje from 1195 until his death. That occurred in, say, after 1207. You see how much we don't know, even for later and much better documented times. Vukan had been appointed to the Dukljan a lordship by his father Stefan Nemanja, as you see here, an appanage, right? And the title referred, however, to Duklja was still the royal one, right? Vukan was Rex, and not just of Duklja, but of a sum of these other territories. That was Dalmatia, Travunia, Toplica, and Hosno. In Latin you have Dioclea, Dalmatia, Tribunia, Toplice, et Kosne, which is relevant because it shows how, of course, like the individual titles, like Duklja came first. So, of course, there was a primacy in there, but, of course, this was also land that now had lost fundamentally its independence, right? And the Nemanjians were just disposing it like of it just as an appanage of some sort. So it's incredibly important as far as everything, like in this sort of temporary rise and fall. You see, this is typical of more unstable places with fewer surplus, etc. That, say, there's the hegemony of one side, then on the other side, and of course, the power starts tilting in favor of one, and in the process, like things stabilize, but it takes a lot. Right here, Serbia was recovering, as we've seen, for very harsh, from harsh times that had followed sort of more compact times. It's as if the two different eras were following. And so you understand also how complicated, especially when you don't have the exact
dates, names of rulers when they died, what kind of real title they had, who supported them, whatever. Things start becoming sort of complicated. Nevertheless, we will look at how the inner Serbian Raskan power managed to sort of gain power, and in a time in which the Byzantines would continue, under the Komnenians, would continue rising, and so also ruling over them. And then there is probably like the sort of the golden age in the 13th and 14th century. This is something we'll see really some other time. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.